A well-ordered crowd. It's quieted down on cue. Very nice. Welcome to today's conversation. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, today's discussion on liberalism, conservatism, and the American founding, which we're holding to honor the centennial of the birth of Russell Kirk. And focused specifically today, although not entirely, but our main focus today is on his book, The Roots of American Order. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion. We will allow our panelists to weigh in with some thoughts, and then I'll moderate a discussion. But I will make sure that we turn to you for discussions with you to take your questions in due course. And in fact, looking at kind of who's in the room, and I'm sure there's a lot of people to say, I'll probably turn to you sooner than I was planning on it, because I think we'll have some people ready to weigh in. I'd like to just let you know who we're joined by today. I know there are many of them. Our panelists are known to many of you, but probably not to all of you. So starting at the end is Ted McAllister, who's an associate professor of public policy at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. Ted is an intellectual historian, and he teaches courses on the foundational moral questions that are at the heart of public policy. He's the author of The Revolt Against Modernity, Leo Strauss, Eric Vogelin, and the Search for a Post-Liberal Order, and is currently working on a project on the history of the baby boomer generation. He holds his PhD in American Intellectual and Cultural History from Vanderbilt University. Seated next to him on his left is Sam Gregg, who's the Director of Research at the Acton Institute. Sam's written and speaks regularly and extensively on political economy, economic history, ethics and finance, and natural law theory. He's the author of numerous books on everything from human flourishing to markets to finance to ethics, and you can find those on his author page at the Acton Institute. He's also a fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and holds his PhD from the University of Oxford. Seated next to me is Dan McCarthy, who's the editor-at-large of Modern Age, which many of you know and read, and also the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellows Program at the Fund for American Studies. His writing has appeared in many places, and you've probably seen it in the New York Times, USA Today, Spectator, National Interest, Reason, and many other publications. And he's been frequently interviewed on outlets such as National Public Radio, BBC, Fox, and other outlets. And outside of his journalism, he worked as Internet Communications Coordinator of the Ron Paul 2008 presidential campaign and has been a senior editor of ISI Books. So Dan, welcome. It's glad to have you here today. Before I turn to our panelists for their remarks, I just wanted to say at the outset that the book, The Roots of American Order, that Russell Kirk published a number of years ago now, starts with a defense of the concept of order itself. It's in the title, and the book starts out with a vigorous defense of the concept of order, something that sounds almost strange to our ears today in an age of disorder or when we don't want to talk about rules and the like. But Kirk has a very well-developed notion of order, both the order of the soul and the order of the commonwealth. And in the opening, he talks about, he tells a story about a college freshman who came up to him and said, I think it's possible for us to rewrite the laws of society from the ground up. Down with the old orders, down with the old morals, down with the history of the U.S. The time has come for us to rewrite a new moral framework for America. And Dr. Kirk said to him, do you think you could build an engine for a car without knowing something about existing laws of mechanics? And the students admitted no, that would probably be hard to do. And his point was, before we tried to build something anew, we really do need to understand where we've come from and where our institutions, where our customs, and where our mores have their origin before we can actually talk about changing some of those, perhaps for the better. And so he begins on this journey, if you haven't read the book, through Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London, and roots Americans' history and our institutions in a story about those four cities. And he says, if you're in Washington, New York, Chicago, or LA, your experience today is derived from those old four cities. And so on he goes through over 400 plus pages of history about the historical, intellectual, institutional roots of American civic and political order. And he was writing at a time when American institutions were suffering erosion, and enduring principles of American public life that were once taken for granted were now in question. And even so, if you go to the end of the book, Kirk ends on a relatively upbeat note. He says, although the tree of American order has grown in height and breadth during the past 100 years, it could not have flourished so if those roots had been unhealthy. Those roots go deep, but they require watering from time to time. Whatever the failings of America in the 8th decade of the 20th century, the American order has been a conspicuous success in the perspective of human history. The American order has been shaken from time to time, that's true, by enormous economic change to population, migration, all kinds of things have challenged it, he says. But the circumstances have changed markedly from time to time, but the laws and the mores have endured. And as Tocqueville knew, the American democracy is the creation of its laws and, in a larger degree, of its moral habits. From time to time, small circles of dissenters have advocated radical alteration of the American order, but they have been rebuffed by public opinion. Substantial reforms, however, have not yet operated to impair the order itself. And whatever America's incertitudes today, it is difficult to find American citizens who can sketch any convincing ideal new order as an alternative to the one long rooted here. It's a relatively optimistic take in an uncertain time, and I'll be interested to see if our panelists share that optimism going forward this many years on. So let me turn it over to you. Ted, I'm going to start with you. You had said in an email leading up to today that you see roots as one of the great, you said, mythopoetic works of the last several centuries, which I thought was an interesting description, and I wonder if you could expand upon that.
First I should tell you that I come from Malibu, and you may think of Malibu as a rootless place, but I brought with me the first edition of Roots of American Order, which was written in Malibu and by Pepperdine Press. So there's a good reason why we should be connected to this event. I'm very happy to be here and honored to be here. I essentially want to make two general claims and then see if we can contextualize them in our discussion. One is about the mythopoetic nature of this book. And if Russell Kirk introduces anything that's extremely important to the American order, it's the necessity of good storytelling. That storytelling and order go together. If liberals had focused on the individual and individual rights and natural rights, and leftists have come to focus on us as social creatures in a certain kind of way, Russell shouldn't be understood primarily, or at least first, as a conservative, but as someone who emphasizes that humans are historical creatures. We're storytelling creatures. And that storytelling creatures are ones who need to belong to a story to have order. And so one of the things that's rather important in our time, and I think one of the things that we don't discuss enough, are what I call the history wars. There are all kinds of claims about our past. There are all kinds of declarations about how we should think about our past. Ones that some say that we ought to reject the past as a useful guide to the present, and others who say we ought to hate it because it's vicious and evil. What Russell did, I think, was to suggest there is a selective and truthful and mythical story of America. Mythical meaning an imaginative way of understanding the deeper truths about America that recognize that it cannot exist. It would not exist. It would not be what it is if it weren't for Hebraic roots, if it were not for Christianity, if it were not for Calvinism. There are these sources that have made possible the very nature of what we call the American order. And that absent that, we don't exist as who we are. Moreover, if we care about preserving, you cannot care about preserving if you don't realize there's something to preserve. And if you can't identify those parts that have made you who you are, that you realize you have an obligation to carry forward. You don't only have an obligation to carry forward those things, you have some obligation to improve them, to find ways in which you must adjust to circumstances. You must, every generation has that obligation of knowing its past in a way that's meaningful and helpful. I add that as an important element. You have to know the past in a way that's meaningful and helpful. And by meaningful, I mean one that provides us with meaning about our purposes in life collectively and individually. And having that understanding of our past, we need to be able to understand our obligations to the future. What is it that we're going to pass down that gives people purpose and meaning, instead of eradicating or eliminating the things that we don't like in such a way that gets rid of the things that make this a healthy political order. I'll get to the second one in due course, but that's but by mythopoetic I meant there's a characterization of America that is selective, it is truthful in the sense it's empirical, but it's also one that allows us to inhabit a story that's our story. And by inhabiting that story, we have purposes and therefore meaning that we don't get any other way.
And you talked about the role of preservation. If I could I just wanted to ask you one question. What are we preserving?
I'm sorry.
What are we preserving?
Well, we're preserving many things. The most important things we're preserving are the constituent elements to make possible an ordered society. The opening chapter of this book, which has, in some ways you could be dismissive of this chapter if you're not careful. Order is prior to liberty. Order is prior to all these other goods that we want. This is true, but he says something. He goes on to make a larger claim, which is that you cannot have an ordered society that emphasizes liberty if you jettison the idea of laws coming from experiences and norms. So what are we preserving? We're preserving the continuity that allows us to understand that we are related to those that came before. I'll rephrase it. We cannot. What we're trying to preserve most of all is a psychological thing. We cannot be who we are without understanding our relationship to those who came before us. And if that changes how we approach everything about our identity. All our institutions, all of the structures of our life, it makes us humble. We cannot begin the process by transforming something, because transforming comes out of our head, right? It comes as some abstract principle. Instead, we have the more complicated and I think richer task of formation. How can we take the story we belong to and the resources our culture has provided us and to continue to form the character of our social and political order?
Okay, thank you. Sam, you've written before about Russell Kirk in the context of the conservative movement, mm-hmm. and I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how you see the roots of American order and his work more generally, and their place within conservatism today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's good to be on this panel with some very good and clear thinkers. The first thing I'd say is that when I think about Russell Kirk and his contribution to, let's call it American conservatism, the American conservative movement, I always start by thinking about what someone else, who is very familiar to people in this audience, wrote in another book, and that is the Nobel economist and I guess philosophical thinker Friedrich Hayek at the end of his book, The Constitution of Liberty. Many of you here will know that the epilogue to that book is a chapter that says, "Why I am not a conservative." Now, I don't know if that was written in response to some things that Russell had written. Annette probably knows. But the thing that's interesting about that particular argument, which I think is not one of Hayek's strongest contributions to political philosophy, but one of the interesting things about that is he says the reason he's fundamentally not a conservative is not because he thinks some conservatives don't understand economics, which he made that critique many times, but his fundamental reason was that he thought that conservatives were people without principles. Now, by that, he didn't mean that conservatives were malintentioned or that they were difficult people or they weren't moral people. What Hayek meant was that he said they have no political principles which enable them to work with people who have different moral values in order to construct a type of society in which people with very different views can get along. Now, I think Hayek's essay has lots of interesting insights, but I think one of the things that Russell Kirk does, one of his achievements that I think is still very relevant to the modern American conservative movement, is that he, in fact, does articulate a principled case for conservatism. His case for conservatism is not just reactionary. His case for conservatism is not nostalgic. His case for conservatism is not pure pragmatism. In fact, he lists 10 principles, 10 very clear principles for what he thinks constitutes conservatism. Let me just quickly go through them. First of all, he says, there's an enduring moral order. Human nature is a constant and moral truths are permanent. That's a principle. It's not a position of pragmatism. It's a statement of truth. He goes on to say the second thing is a conservative adheres to customs, conventions, and continuity because there is wisdom in the past which we ignore at our peril. He thirdly says conservatives believe in what Kirk called the principle of prescription. We believe in precedent. We believe in prescription and precepts, again because of the wisdom of the past. Fourth, he says, conservatives are guided by the principle of prudence. Now, prudence is not pragmatism. He means prudence as the master virtue for clear reasoning. Fifth, he says, conservatives are attentive to the principle of variety. And he doesn't mean diversity. What he means is long-established variety in social institutions that makes a vivid contrast to what he called deadening egalitarianism. Sixth, he says, conservatives hold to the principle of imperfectibility. There's no heaven on earth, and those who think there is usually take us in the direction of tyranny and gulags. Seventh, he says, conservatives believe that freedom and property are closely linked. And that's partly, he says, for economic reasons, but also because he says, upon the foundation of private property, great civilizations are built. Eighth, he says, conservatives uphold voluntary community just as much as they oppose involuntary collectivism. Ninth, he says, conservatives perceive the need for prudent restraints upon power and human passions. And 10th, he says, conservatives understand that permanency and change must be reconciled and recognized in any free and rigorous society. Now, thanks to Kirk, I think it's true to say, these principles made their way into the modern American conservative project, giving it, I think, a rigor, a strength, and a consistency that you don't find, for example, in many strands of European conservatism. If anyone here can tell you what the current Tory party stands for, I'll give you a lot of money. Now, what's more, I think, is very important about this is that Kirk's principled conservatism takes liberty very seriously. It is, of course, preceded by order. Kirk talks about order, as Ted pointed out, all the time. But he takes liberty very seriously, and I think that owes a great deal to his long-standing engagement with the thought, of course, of Edmund Burke, someone who Hayek was actually drawn to in the later part of his life. Now, I think that it's true to say that if you look at Kirk's 10 conservative principles, you can find them all in Burke. And Burke, I think, like Kirk, brings together this commitment to liberty on the one hand and a commitment to order and authority as well in a way that very few people have managed to do. In other words, you might say he takes what's best of the pre-modern tradition and the modern tradition and brings them together in a way that adds strength and rigor to American conservatism that I think matters even more if principled conservatism is going to have a future in America.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Giving us lots to come back to in our discussion time. Dan, so what about liberals and libertarians? Sam's just been talking about conservatism, and I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah,
anything else you want to say?
Around the time that Russell Kirk published The Conservative Mind, there was something of a vogue of liberal intellectuals sort of writing conservatism out of American history. So think of Lewis Hartz's book, The Liberal Tradition in the United States. That's a book in which he basically says that America has only a liberal tradition. It does not really have a conservative tradition because Hartz sees a conservative tradition as being a continental European kind of tradition, as being tied to the ancien regime or to feudalism. Also, you have Lionel Trilling, who I think somewhat is not always given due credit. He's a famous phrase about how, at the time in the 1950s when he was writing this essay, there was no sort of serious intellectual conservatism. They were just irritable mental gestures seeking to resemble ideas, passing for conservatism. I think people sometimes look at that phrase in isolation, and they think that Trilling was simply being a kind of liberal bigot, that he simply was dismissing all conservatives. He does say, even in that essay, that there are some isolated and ecclesiastical exceptions to that rule. But really what Trilling was trying to do was to say that liberals do need conservatives, and they do need to seek out, kind of every John Stuart Mill needs a Coleridge to seek out, to provide a certain kind of spiritual balance, to provide a criticism of their own ideas. There was this tradition in liberalism that had that kind of open-mindedness that was very valuable. And certainly John Stuart Mill himself, owed a great debt to Coleridge for kind of humanizing him and for bringing him out of the kind of stupor that his father's utilitarianism had reduced him to. So it seems to me that there is a humanity in conservatism, especially the humane conservatism of Russell Kirk, that has to be rediscovered even by people on the opposite side of politics from him, even among progressives, even among liberals, and even among libertarians, people whom he often criticized as chirping sectaries. Now, today's panel has as its theme not only liberalism and conservatism, but also the American founding. And it seems to me that our panel as a whole is somewhat in the shadow of Patrick Deneen's recent book, Why Liberalism Failed, which, interestingly enough, has had a somewhat favorable reception among some liberals. It made Barack Obama's summer reading list, for example. Obama, to his credit, actually has been well read among more conservative authors in the past. In graduate school, he did read and seemed to take quite seriously at least some of T.S. Eliot. Deneen's book might be seen as being, I think his critics might say that the book has a kind of theoretically anti-American bent, not a practically anti-American bent, but a theoretically anti-American bent, in that it's very critical of Lockeanism, it's very critical of the American style of individualism that has emerged over the last 200 years. And Deneen traces that all back to the founding itself, to the influence of John Locke and people like Thomas Jefferson, to the influence of a kind of proto-liberal intellectual tradition already upon people like James Madison and upon Publius and the Federalist. Russell Kirk, I think, provides a balance and a tonic to Deneen's very critical view of the American founding. And you see this in The Roots of American Order. You see it also in The Conservative Mind. In a strange way, Deneen actually kind of agrees with some of the mid-20th century liberals who tended to write out American conservatism from the American experience. For Deneen, it's not that there are no American conservatives, it's not that there's not any kind of local or sort of passing conservatism in the American tradition, but Deneen is very critical of the idea that there is a sort of central conservatism in the American tradition of, say, the Declaration of Independence or of the Federalist Papers. And Russell Kirk has a different view there. Even when it comes to someone like John Locke, who's very much a figure that Deneen is quite critical of, Kirk is not simply demonizing John Locke. And you see that there's a passage on Locke in The Roots of American Order. What Kirk does, how he approaches Locke, is actually, I think, the best way. There are some Locke partisans who see Locke as kind of a source of timeless wisdom, and through his influence on the American founding, someone whose principles must inform us today. Then there are others, such as Patrick Deneen, who see Locke as kind of a tempter who has introduced a certain kind of individualism and anti-community ethos into first English and now Anglo-American political culture that is very dangerous and destructive. Kirk, on the other hand, doesn't take either of those extreme views. He rather sees Locke as having been someone who basically was writing within a limited historical context for a rather limited historical purpose in the second treatise, namely that he was trying to make the case against Robert Filmer, make the case against royal absolutism, and make the case for something rather similar to the sort of settlement of 1688. This, I think, speaks also to the question of order, because when we look at the Declaration of Independence, when we look at John Locke, we should keep in mind the very real questions of political order that both of them had to answer. And you can even go back to Hobbes and find the same thing. There are deficiencies in social contract theory and in this sort of what gets perceived as a liberal tradition arising out of it, which arise from transposing this tradition into places where it really was not meant to be taken. That you're not looking at necessarily a great theory of society, especially in someone like John Locke, but you're rather looking at a theory of political legitimacy, a rather limited one, that's meant to apply to the circumstances of an England which has just gone through several upheavals of political order. The English Civil War, it's gone through the Restoration, and then the Revolution of 1688. Into the 18th century, these kinds of difficulties of the English constitutionalism, English constitutional order, were still very much present in the minds not only of Englishmen, such as Edmund Burke, but also in the minds of the American colonists. And this is why Locke becomes very valuable when the American colonists come to ask the question of what kind of political order they're going to found as they separate themselves from the King of England. But those questions are all very limited, and as Ted's remarks had mentioned, there is a much greater mythopoetic level which should be kept in mind, which should not be something we try to derive from Thomas Jefferson or from John Locke. Rather, it's a much broader and larger picture of society, which must come from looking at history in a much wider context, not as simply something that begins in 1776 or something that begins with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but rather we have traditions of liberty and traditions of order, traditions of experience with the transcendent, which go back some 2,000 years. And that's very much what the lesson of The Roots of American Order is. That's why it remains an invaluable book today. In some ways, it's a book that sidesteps but also sort of solves and addresses the otherwise intractable political, ideological problems between conservatives and liberals today.
Very good. Thanks. Thanks very much. Well, since this has come up a little bit, let me start here. I want to talk just a little bit about this issue of individualism and how to think about it in the context of The Roots of American Order. You mentioned Hayek's criticism of this essentially kind of conservatism in Europe, and there's an argument to be made that that what he was essentially also saying was that conservatism in the U.S. is just different. It's something that has a different set of origins. Classical liberalism, in some ways, has the principles within which we're conserving and so on. Someone else who criticized him very publicly, actually they argued publicly about this, was Frank Meyer, and as this has been accounted by George Nash and others, and some of you probably have read these pieces where essentially Meyer, former communist, now kind of has a conversion, libertarian, finds that the rights in the individual are sort of inviolable, and criticizes Russell Kirk for essentially his view, articulated throughout his works in the conservative mind when he said individualism is atomism and conservatism is community of spirit. Frank Meyer's basic point was you don't have a principle within conservatism that can be self-correcting against those communities when they go wrong, and the individual is where that principle originates. Who's right? You ran through, Sam, you ran through the principles in the Politics of Prudence, and that Kirk was very articulate about these principles. But does Meyer not have a point that there is something within the notion of individual rights and all that implies that gives you the sort of corrective measure when communities themselves actually go off the rails or incomplete?
Well, of course, I think a lot of the answer to that depends upon where these individual rights are derived from. So if they're simply declarations of the state, well, what the state gives, the state can take away very quickly. But I think if individual rights are essentially grounded upon a robust account of natural law, which I've written about in different places, then I think, in that sense, it's not just that individual rights can be a corrective to certain forms of community which become suffocating or downright reactionary, but rather point back to the source of these rights and the purpose of these rights, which is to enable and encourage human flourishing, which Kirk speaks a lot about in terms of why you have community, why you need to put limits on state power, why things like property actually matter. It's not just that property is there because it's just happens to be economically useful, although it is. It's much more about how do these rights play out in terms of the context of human flourishing. So I think Kirk has a pretty good answer to that. And remember, the first principle he quotes is really that he says, look, there is a moral order, there is a human nature, it doesn't change. Now, I find it very difficult to read that anything else than as a pretty bold claim for natural law. So I think as long as those rights are linked back to natural law, which some people don't, it's just a straight natural rights argument for a lot of people, but if they're rooted back to natural law and coherent accounts of natural law, then I think they can become the type of corrective that someone like Meyer is talking about. I don't know that he rooted them back the same way. Others who are more familiar with Meyer's thought will know that. But I think if that's the way you go, then those rights can play that role in protecting the individual in societies where there's a temptation for communities to become seen as simply things for themselves rather than helping to uplift the individual and all the other communities that they belong to.
Good. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, we have to remember that Russell Kirk was, in some fundamental sense, an historian, not a political theorist. Mm-hmm. And so he approaches questions of Locke's ideas about natural rights with an historical imagination that begins with a recognition of complexity and contingency and a bit of irony as well. So the problem is that when political theorists like Patrick Deneen and others want to talk about individualism or they want to talk about Locke, what they do is they often sort of abstract them from that context and declare they have a kind of logic that unfolds, that's built into them. And Russell recognized, I think, much better than the political theorists did, that you don't get John Locke's understanding of natural rights without an understanding of natural law, first of all. You don't get, can you imagine a Locke's theories of natural law, which, by the way, he didn't call himself a liberal, right? These are all anachronistic terms we're putting back, conservative and liberal. But you don't get Locke, any of Locke, without some understanding of the truths that the Hebrews found about God and order and law. You don't get John Locke's argument if you don't have an understanding that there are natural institutions like family and church and communities in which individual rights are contextualized, in which they're actualized, in which people are formed to live well with an understanding of their morally given rights in nature. You don't also get his particular construction of natural rights, particularly the property, without the Huguenots and without a whole series of Calvinist thinkers who had a very important element that that has to be attached to his argument about individual rights, which is a biblical anthropology. Humans are sinful. Humans are flawed. And therefore, there's a deep distrust of power and what power can do that helps understand why individualism is both important and why it must not be understood in an abstract way, but in a contextualized way. So if you think as an historian, you see Locke very differently than if you're looking to see how can I abstract a set of principles in one of the few abstract works that Locke actually wrote. Most of them tend to be more empirical. And what's the logic of that? You get very different understandings of Locke and what his principles meant and how they were contextualized.
I would agree with that. The natural rights that one finds in Locke are fairly limited, and we've seen a couple of centuries of perversions of those ideas, most spectacularly perhaps with the French Revolution, the Declaration of Rights of Man, but going on into the 20th century, there's also been a multiplication of various claims of natural rights and human rights and so forth. These are easily understandable from a historically contingent point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, they're often on quite a shaky basis. With Locke, there's specifically, you have certain natural rights because, there is a creator, there is a God. Locke was probably a Socinian himself. He was on the one hand, he was in conformity with the Church of England, but on the other hand, he was almost perhaps in his personal views close to being what we might call a Unitarian. But he did believe in some sort of creator God, and that creator God is benevolent. He has given the earth to humanity in common. It's interesting that Locke actually begins the second treatise not with individualism, but with what might almost be called primitive universal communism. But the reason we have individual rights is because we have all been given our lives by God. These lives are for the purpose of furthering humanity, and furthering humanity is basically also furthering the work of God. It's furthering God's purpose, or the purpose for which God has created man. And in order to do these things, we have to be protected against certain abuses by other individuals. We can't take our own lives, for example, because that would be dereliction of our duty to God. Therefore, other people can't take our lives arbitrarily either. The right to liberty also derives from this sort of subtext, because if you give someone, a right to perfect control over yourself, if you become a slave or basically someone else's chattel, that's equivalent to surrendering your own life, because then your life can be taken at this other person's whim and discretion. The right to property ultimately derives from the fact that if we have a right to life, then we have a right to the means necessary for our sustenance and for our survival. And Locke articulates that throughout the course of the second treatise in such a way as to show why inequalities emerge from an original state of equality, why private property emerges from a state of original sort of divinely ordained communism, and so forth. I think if we remember these philosophical as well as historical contexts, it helps to prevent the sort of hypertrophy of rights language and rights talk in a way that has been harmful to sort of the social order in the 21st century. Kirk, as a historian, as Ted has said, he was immunized against some of the tendencies to overinflate from a philosophical direction the claims of natural rights and natural law. On the other hand, he was also, I think, perhaps a little bit too hard even on John Locke, because he didn't see that there was a built-in philosophical limitation on the way that Lockean rights in particular were directed.
Good. So I do want to come back to the topic of natural law since you've all talked about it. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about this notion of customs and the importance of customs in American order. I've kind of read the roots of American order over the years as a historically conservative defense of essentially American liberalism, small L liberalism, that in many ways kind of a pre-rebuttal to Deneen's thesis, and that what Kirk's articulating throughout the book is that we have customs and institutions that are rooted in very strong notions of restraint. Restraint on the ability of ideological zealots to run everything through checks and balances, but also restraint on harmful or degrading self-expression through religious institutions, through mores, and sometimes even the law. And I think there's probably widespread agreement, my guess is there would be within this room, that some of the institutions through which these customs are perpetuated over the years, religious institutions, civic organizations, families, the communities within which they're anchored, through which we actually understand and appreciate and know how to participate within the institutions that these customs support, that they're in decline. That if we're talking about the importance of preserving the customs that are at the heart of the American project, what are those customs? Are they in trouble today? It's easy to use the word custom, but sometimes it's a little bit hard to define what we actually mean. So I'm curious to know what you think about that notion, because it's very important throughout Russell Kirk's work. And in the roots of American order, it's very much a defense not just of our political institutions, through which American order is preserved and sustained, but also through more informal institutions, the mediating institutions of our public and personal life. So what are customs, as Kirk understands it? And are they in trouble? And if they are, can you actually recover them?
Right. The difficulty of your question is testimony of the problem we're in. Right. If you go back 20 or 30 or 50 years to the conservative debates, you often get those who will argue that a dependence upon customs is a kind of relativism, right? And they throw this word around with regard to both Burke and Kirk in different ways. It suggests that, well, the customs emerge from particular experiences and from particular people, and therefore this is a kind of, or if you're Strauss, you're an historicist. And as you get this battle that rages in different forms between those who who want to say that we need to hold on to these natural rights as the defining characteristic of our principles, as though they've been articulated in a way that we can hold on to, we can define, we can see it whenever it's being violated. The problem with that argument is that it has left us without an ability to talk about the actual experiences in the Anglo-American tradition that have emerged, that have given us precedent, that have given us, and how those have emerged. So my first answer to your question about customs or response is that we have a problem in the way we've discussed this in the past with an artificial distinction. As I tried to suggest earlier, you don't really get Locke, as he understood himself at least, outside of the natural institutions that he could depend upon that formed children into people who are capable of belonging to a community and having vested in them these rights. And so there's something strangely abstract about that. On the other hand, hasn't been among those on my side, the traditionalist, there's not been a very good defense and argument about how it is that customs emerge out of experiences that find a way of articulating a set of ready-made principles that more or less cohere to universal natural principles. Now that only functions, there may be other reasons why it doesn't function, but it only functions if people have robust, again I go back to natural communities. If we cannot understand that families are prior to any other social institution and that families are the necessary condition for the proper formation of an orderly society and for the formation of character within individuals who can live well in a society that has a great deal of liberty. If we can't understand that along with a variety of other institutions, some of which are truly natural in the sense that they are universal, and others which are natural in the sense that they have emerged out of a set of experiences but solve or address a human problem, like various kinds of voluntary institutions in the American story. And if we can understand that there is a relationship between habits, customs, and principles that emerge from them, and some understanding of a natural a law that also understood to have rights as among our moral bequest as moral beings, then we're going to be stuck in this horribly sterile debate about whether conservatism is about natural rights in an abstract sense, or is it about customs and traditions only. They go together. And so the question that I have is, have we gone so far in creating an administrative state, in creating through certain other structures of our society, very complex, that have forced us into a different kind of individualism in which we are disconnected or tenuously connected to the very institutions that shape us and form us so that we can be our true selves. And so I keep going back to the language of transformation versus formation, because I think it's at the heart of this. Transformation is a project that says we're going to create you according to an abstract principle, and formation says you emerge out of these experiences and traditions to be who you ought to be. And if you're born in South Carolina in 1970, you're going to be somebody, if you're going to be true to yourself, who has the richness of that experiences, of that community, of that set of historical dynamics that you wouldn't be if you were born in Malibu. So the customs become a way in which our experiences lead to principles, but only if they come out of those institutions that form the individuals, or form the persons, I should say.
Any other thoughts on customs before I...
Yeah, I'm like Ted. I get very frustrated with the intra-conservative argument about customs and traditions on one hand and natural law and natural rights on the other. I think one of the things that Kirk was particularly good at doing, and I think he more or less gets this from Burke, is he shows how many of these customs that we often don't quite understand, but we know they're there and we know that they're important, actually have built into them these universal principles that can be known via reason. So something like property, it's developed in a particular way through particular experiences in the context of, say, Britain. You had through the common law, etc. That's playing a major role in the way that we understand property. But there's also a reasoning process that's going on as those things are developing, because judges aren't just saying, well, this is how it was always done, so therefore it's always done this way. They're actually going back and reasoning through and thinking through the customs and identifying what are the principles that are applicable here and how might they apply in new conditions. So I think that there's a lot of work needs to be done to put these two things back together, and I think Kirk and Burke provide us with a way of doing so. In terms of fixing the problems, in the sense that so many of these customs, these institutions are under assault today. One of the things I find is that, on the one hand, this is partly because the left and progressives want to tear these things down. I don't think there's any question about that. Just read Gramsci, it's all there. He's got the whole plan. It's all flowing out now. But the other part of the problem is that a lot of Americans who are not particularly influenced by progressivism or leftism just don't know this stuff. They don't know the history of these things and why these things are important. And one of the things that Kirk's Roots of American Order did was to remind people of that. So that, what Ted keeps saying, this story that needs to be retold over and over again, I think is one way in which you reinforce these customs and these traditions and these institutions and come to know the logic that permeates them at the same time.
Okay. Very good. I just wanted to bring that up because customs is not a particularly enthralling subject for Gen Z or even millennials for that matter. It's not something that you talk about. It's very central to this book, and it's central for our understanding of what Russell Kirk means by order. I've got a number of other questions I could ask, but I do want to turn it over to you for you to ask some questions and engage with our panelists. We have some microphones that can come to you, so if you raise your hand, just wait for the mic to come. And we have just two rules here. One, please be succinct, brief, and two, please make sure your question is in the form of a question. Let's go ahead and start right back here in the middle.
Was there any earlier statement of these basic rights in the colonies before George Mason's Declaration of Rights of Man that then had a further influence on the French Declaration of Rights and so on? And of course, it's closely followed by the original Bill of Rights in our Constitution.
The question is there what was the question again?
Something in the colonies prior to Mason's?
I think there are precedents. There's a book by Wilmore Kendall and George Carey, Basic Symbols of the American Political Tradition, which looks a little bit at sort of the evolution of American rights in the context of the larger colonial and then sort of post-colonial traditions. I don't want to name the particular documents. I know they take a look at the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut and a few other things. But one of the things you find is that rights develop out of earlier commitments in terms of duties and in terms of other language. So one of the things I think is a little bit troubling is that we see from the language of duty, we then get a derived language of rights. From the language of rights, we then get other derivations that are sort of progressively getting you further and further away from real political community, and instead are starting to have the kind of socially atomizing effect that Patrick Deneen sees in modern liberalism. So there are precedents, but the precedents may not be in the language of rights that we expect. They're instead in the language of duties and kind of what is concomitant with those duties.
The one thing I would add to that is that I think it would have been very common in the colonies long before George Mason for people to talk about the rights of Englishmen, to use that type of language, rights under common law. Now, they wouldn't have put it in as precise terms as Dan just described, But I think that's clearly part of what's going on. These things just don't fall out of the sky. There are people who have thought about these things. These things are part of the way that the Anglo-Scottish and Irish migrants talked about these sorts of things. But I also think they employed language of covenant, for example. That's another way in which they would have, which is a religious language, of course, very much coming from particular forms of Calvinism, Presbyterianism. And that type of language, I think, you would have found very common when people were trying to articulate what we would talk about in terms of rights, but which they use different language to describe.
Actually, there are many documents that you could go to. But the interesting thing is that most of them is that they tended to put together the rights of Englishmen in Virginia or the rights of Englishmen here with these things we pledge to each other about our obligations. So the covenant, even if it didn't use specific covenantal language in some of the places further south, they did use covenantal ideas that said that these are our rights as Englishmen in this place. But we also are pledging these obligations we have to each other to make this work. So I think, yes, there's a long tradition. But I would point to one example that is really upsetting or frustrating. The understandings of the common law were widely held that slavery, I forgot what you would probably know, on English soil was the principle or something along those lines. And the principle was that slavery is not allowed on English soil.
It was Scotland which first did it.
Well, of course, the Scotsman and McAllister.
And the Greggs.
And Parliament, and so all forms of slavery that emerged after 1600 in any of the on English soils, including ships, by the way, which are covered by this principle, were done by positive law in contravention to common law. And most of when the colonists talked about their rights as they talked about the rights as Englishmen, which sounds like it's very it's very relativistic. These are our rights, and it's certainly true that's the case. But they also understood them to be the carriers of universal truths. These are our expressions through our experience of 1,000 years that we now understand and articulate it this way. And there are our English laws, to be sure. And they emerge from the people, which means, of course, the cumulative experience of the people, not just those who happen to be living right now. And these are moral principles that are universal, but we articulate them in English language and with English colors. I know.
Okay.
Fundamental
Tim.
mistake.
Hi, thank you. Tim Carney. You guys touch a couple times on the importance of either Presbyterianism or Calvinism in sort of this American idea of order and liberty, but I feel like we could talk about that a lot more. I mean, was our Protestant sort of being born as a Protestant country crucial to it? If so, what ideas are they specifically from Calvinism? Or, I mean, what would you guys say about how America's Protestant roots define our understanding of order? And when I think about Patrick Deneen, I think about, well, there was this sort of seed of an idea of progress that was planted there, and that no Protestant country would ever sort of satisfy him. I mean, is that part of the tension here?
How much time do you have? I mean, you're certainly right about Patrick's view of this. There's two books I would go to on this and put them together. Albion Seed, which I think is one of the most brilliant histories in the last generation or two, that traces where people in England came from and where they landed in America and how that had an enduring, hundreds of years effect on the kind of cultures that emerged, including those Reformed Christians who greatly outnumbered non-Reformed in most colonies, not just New England. That certainly had an effect. But then there's a book that people don't talk about that I think is very, at least in this core principle, very consistent with Russell's argument. It's John Patrick Diggins' The Lost Soul of American Politics. And this is an argument that says if we lose if we think about America without its Calvinism, without that particular kind of biblical anthropology that is truly worried about, on a daily basis, about human sinfulness, but also stressing at the same time a fairly radical view in context of its own time of individual liberty. And putting those together, if you lose that fear of power and that fear of what happens when order breaks down, then you get a very different America. You don't essentially you don't have an American founding. And part of this is written, I think, in the 80s. Part of Diggins' argument was we've lost that in the last 100 years or so, we've lost that fear, even a secularized version of it. We found it in Niebuhr and a few other places, but it's largely gone, that we have that kind of fear of power and that kind of anthropology at work and how we understand humans as rights-bearing beings. And once again, the historian, John Patrick Diggins, stresses the complexity of this, and if you disentangle them, you lose it. We do not have America without, Americanism depends upon many things prior to it, one of which is a kind of reformed Christianity that has a much greater effect in America than it does in England, or much less the rest of the continent.
Okay, let's go back here in this corner so we can get spatial diversity in the questions.
Hello, my name is Nicole Penn. I work here at the American Enterprise Institute. I was wondering if Russell Kirk had any interaction with the writings of Hannah Arendt, and if so, if he would have any thoughts on her conception of revolution as not the creation of something new, but literally a return back to, like a literal revolution, a return back to something that had already been established, and the definition of the American Revolution in that way.
Well, I don't know if Kirk said anything about her and her different reflections, but I think it's pretty clear if you look at the way he understands the American Revolution, it is that type of revolving back to restore freedoms and liberties that had been secured by the Glorious Revolution. I mean, the American colonists were pretty clear that that's part of what they were trying to do. This is what they insisted on, their rights of Englishmen. Their supporters in Britain at the time would constantly say this is not just about the American colonies and taxation, this is also about the creeping tendency of George III's administration to gradually wind back and create a greater role for the monarch, etc., etc. So if that's what she means by revolving back, and I think that's what Kirk has in mind when he talks about the American Revolution in the context of restoring a type of order, then yes, I think there is some sort of comparison that can be made.
Okay, let's go up here to the front. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Carl Galvin, retired customs agent, domain reference and idea, liveson.net. Also worked in the Ron Paul campaign as security director in 2008, along with Dan. My question, which I'll need to follow with a brief foundation, is the extent to which honest weights and measures, a scriptural idea, are essential to functioning commerce, building families and society, in particular the monetary unit. And there was some economic chaos between the period of the Declaration and the Constitution, at which time Roger Sherman put the words in the Constitution, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin, a tender in payment of debts." Up to that point, each colony had its own paper system of credit. Rhode Island vastly overinflated how much currency they put into circulation, so wealth was stolen from adjoining areas and drawn to Rhode Island and created a great deal of conflict. Just for reference, Roger Sherman, 1752, wrote a paper explaining essentially his monetary experience. Is titled "A Caveat Against Injustice or an Inquiry into the Evils of a Fluctuating Medium of Exchange." Yeah, the title tells the whole story. And Thomas Jefferson said of Sherman, he's a man who'd never said a foolish thing in his life, which is pretty high praise for anyone. So the monetary issue, have we drifted far from that with our inflating system of credit? Are we now, in a sense, almost Rhode Island to the world and need to... Yeah, and overinflating, and maybe we need to restore a monetary order as for a time we had with Bretton Woods.
Anybody want to take that on? It's a little.
I'd just say that while Russell Kirk was not a monetary theorist, and to the best of my knowledge, monetary theory, it certainly doesn't appear in Roots of American Order or the American Mind. He did do a textbook on economics in the late 1980s, I believe, and there could be a chapter on monetary policy in there. I have the book, but I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. But I'd be surprised if he gets into monetary policy there. But I would say that I think the Kirkian approach to the question would be through the lens of custom and convention, and the idea that when you have new institutions and new governmental or quasi-governmental powers created through institutions like the Federal Reserve, that this, on the one hand, is a kind of worrying from just we like money because, we like gold and silver because these are traditional forms of money, that this is the custom we're used to, and we don't like moving away from that. And there's also the question of, I think a lot of people in this town, for example, are very disturbed by the fact that, the Federal Reserve commands great authority in some circles, but in sort of populist circles, it is quite a demonic force out there. It's something that, various political campaigns can be organized to oppose. And I think Russell Kirk would say, well, this is what you get when you go away from a conventional order, from a customary order that people are familiar with and trust, through the experience of ages, and instead move to an order that is administrative or technocratic or generally something that people feel disconnected and distant from.
Okay, I think we have a question in the back.
My name is Luke Phillips. I have a quick question about Kirk's relations to some other conservative scholars of his own time. Right around the time he was writing his opening books there, a guy named Clinton Rossiter published a book called Conservatism in America in 1955. A guy named Peter Viereck wrote a book called The Conservatism Revisited in 1949, addressing the same ideas about conservatism, preserving civilization, cynical about human nature, respect for law, all that kind of stuff. I have not studied Kirk deeply enough to understand how he related to these individuals and their thoughts, but my impression has been that they were more open to making peace with the New Deal and modernity, whereas Russell Kirk obviously joined in on the conservative movement, working with Buckley, working with the future Goldwaters and Reagans. And so I was wondering, is the conservatism of Kirk and of the old new conservatives, is it only really worth looking at in the context of modern political conservatism, or is there a deeper and perhaps a broader way of looking at it that is not just within the conservative movement since the 1950s?
I heard there were 5 people in your age who knew who Clinton Rossiter was, and you're one of them. You're maybe the president of their club. I don't know. In the early 50s, there were a number of people trying to reclaim the word conservative. Some others who were trying to reclaim some of the ideas but not using it, including Daniel Borston and a few others. But I think I disagree with your premise that I don't find many in the conservative movement to be as hostile to the New Deal through the 60s and 70s as they claim to be in practice. So it seems that a number of the politically motivated conservatives gave up on the idea of rescinding the New Deal and its principles. And I don't find in the Reagan years, for instance, any particularly strong appeal to constitutional principles that have been abrogated in the years, the 30 years prior to his administration. They largely didn't challenge some of those, the changes that had taken place. So I think that in the 50s, there's a clear sense that there is something called conservatism in America. But we don't know what it is. And why do we not know what it is? Well, because the nature of a set of principles that you take for granted until they get challenged and you begin to start trying to articulate why we should keep those principles is that it doesn't become visible to themselves or to others until there's some crisis in which they come to defend something. Why should this not change? Or why should it not change the way it changed? And so I find that late 40s, early 50s, a kind of struggling to figure out we know something's amiss. We know that there's been a turn in our society, our culture, and our politics. The question is, what is it we're trying to preserve and why? The question I couldn't answer from that Ryan asked. It's a huge question because if you're truly a conservative by temperament and disposition, then you don't know what you're seeking to preserve until somehow it's threatened, and then you have to figure out why. You then go to the ground of principles, find an articulation of it. But the thing about it is, conservatives, properly speaking, don't have the luxury of going to a simplistic, abstract construction of it. Instead, we must make an argument in the context of complexity and contingency. And the one thing that we haven't talked, I don't know if we're going to ever get a chance to, and tied to this, is that in the 1950s to now, the problem of equality in the American context has never been properly resolved within the conservative movement. In some ways, Roots of American Order was premised upon, was responding to the Tocqueville's warning that a people who believe in equality in some fundamental way are going to be attracted to universal claims that are simple, abstract, and drawn from their own mind. And they are therefore not disposed by nature to think they owe something to the past or to the future, and that the American order, if it's going to survive, must fight that tendency that Tocqueville suggested was inherent in people of equality. The problem is that many in the conservative movement decided to embrace equality of a certain sort, and therefore were lost not even knowing what the word means, having an utter lack of sophistication in terms of our politics. Our politics is useless now in terms of the question of equality. We don't even know how to talk about it. And the places where we do know how to talk about it doesn't have any impact on anybody.
A few historical footnotes to the question. The political divisions, the actual partisan divisions between these three thinkers clarify things somewhat. So Peter Viereck was, I think, a two-time Adlai Stevenson voter. Russell Kirk was not only, he may have voted for Eisenhower, but I know that Kirk's preference was for Robert Taft in the Republican primaries. So Kirk definitely was on the right in a way that Peter Viereck was not. And all of these figures, Rossiter, Viereck, Kirk, a few others too, Robert Nisbet was often thrown in the pot as well, were collected under a single rubric as the so-called new conservatives in this period. And that led to a lot of misunderstandings because ideas of one thinker were then transposed and connected to another thinker. And Russell Kirk often got the worst of this. This is actually, I think, one of the origins of the long-running hostility between Frank Meyer and Russell Kirk. Frank Meyer thought that because Kirk was writing, in a kind of similar vein and similar style and using the word conservative just as Viereck and Rossiter had, that therefore he was just as much of what Meyer would consider a statist as Viereck and Rossiter were. So Meyer, the first thing he writes about this is a very hostile essay attacking the new conservatives as a category, as a whole, and including Russell Kirk in that category. And Kirk is sort of doubly offended by that, because on the one hand, he's rejecting the criticisms from Meyer, but he's also not happy to be grouped in with Viereck and Rossiter, people he doesn't particularly want to defend. I do think there's value to be had in re-examining Rossiter and Viereck, but one has to take them with a grain of salt, as one should, perhaps most thinkers.
Just one thing on Rossiter. I was recently reading his book on Alexander Hamilton and the Constitution, which I read is more or less Rossiter trying to reconcile the right to the New Deal. He more or less says, and I think it's a very bad comparison, he says, just as Hamilton set up the financial system so that people like Jefferson really couldn't, they weren't in a position to really reverse anything. He basically said, this is the situation we're faced with the New Deal. We really can't do too much to dismantle it, so we have to adapt. Conservatives have to adapt to this new reality, which is not what people like Kirk were saying. Right? So, and I think this point about how all these thinkers get sort of put into one box is very important, because it's very clear when it came to some of these fundamental divisions within American politics. These people are on very different sides.
Okay, I'm going to take one more over here, and I apologize that I'm not going to be able to get through everyone's questions before we run out of time today. Yep.
Yeah, I was there, all right? And I can tell you, Professor McAllister, that there was a crisis, and we thought it was the New Deal. And what separated Kirk from Rossiter was the fact of the New Deal and not accepting it and accepting it. My question really is, it's so interesting you use the word frustrating in talking about natural law and trying to get simple things like the family understood. And Sam, what word? Upset is a word he has about trying to get across this. And I'm surprised McCarthy didn't raise this issue. This issue of dealing with natural law on a natural basis, first point, Kirk, it's enduring moral order. It's not custom, all right? That's number one on the list. Just one, the book, What is Conservatism? There's a Stanley Perry article in there I really recommend you look at. I was forced to look at it for a meeting, and he brings up this issue is, can you teach natural law in modern times? And this is 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And Frank Meyer, I was very close to Frank and Russell. Frank wrote an article at the time saying, oh, this is much too pessimistic. We can all talk about this. This is a good, solid country. When I went back and read it again, I think Perry's right. I mean, the reason you're frustrated and upset is that we got to look serious about how do you deal with this transcendent question or the enduring part of it rather than custom. That's my question.
Well, I'll go first. I also said frustrated as well, so I'm upset and frustrated. I'm not a Freudian. The question about natural law. Natural law has never been, if you look at the history, whether you go back to Plato or to more contemporary thinkers, natural law has always been contested. So the sophists are doing it at the time of Plato and Aristotle. We have people like Hume and his sort of philosophical skepticism in the 18th century. You have the rise of legal positivism, etc. And yet, natural law hasn't gone away. It's still the alternative to, I think, philosophically speaking, and not at all wanting to take away the importance of custom and historically contextualizing these things. Natural law is still the number one opponent to what I think is more or less nihilism. Still is. And it's not hard to teach. I teach it all the time. The problem is it's not taught as much as it should be. It's often wrapped up in all sorts of clothing, which I think people are initially resistant to. But I think it's an enduring part of the conservative tradition. And of course, the difficulty is when it gets detached from the historical context, which we've been saying here is very, very important. Because if you don't understand what's going on in the medieval period, when Aquinas is writing, or if you don't understand what people like Grotius and Pufendorf and Emir de Vattel are writing about in the 18th century and what they're dealing with, or what we're dealing with today, then I think it's harder to teach. But I think it's still an enduring part of the tradition. And I'll tell you what, it's a lot more alive in America than it is in Europe. A lot more alive.
You know, we live in a time where there are ideological assaults on nature. There's an attack upon nature itself. You know, as I was reading through Roots this time, I kept thinking of how much better written it is than Vogelin, but how much it connects with Vogelin's argument about order. And I think there's this it goes back to the 1950s and what they were struggling to figure out in the 50s. And what I believe is the essence of the Anglo-American conservative movement. It responds to disorder. That it goes so that and whenever there's whenever there's an assault upon nature, there's an attempt to change who we are as humans, and we want to be the creators instead of the creatures. When that happens, and the institutions that are appropriate to human flourishing, however they may appear in their various forms, but whenever we have to go after those institutions through with the kind of power of the state and other institutions, the inevitable effect, from my point of view, of agreeing with that essentially natural law is an operative part of human life, is that we experience disorder, and that causes us to search for order, and for a rearticulation of order in a different time. So I think Russell would probably say he was no optimist, but he was hopeful. The Christian principle of hope, particularly, and we have so many experiences with it. We have so much. Look at what happened to the English traditions that predated the Norman invasion. A great number of them survived and came back, were revived, because they worked as a part of the English order, even after the Norman attempted to transform the English. We have many examples. So what may go on for 100 years of disorder or attempts to destroy an existing order or the natural order inevitably must return to some search. Just as the Europeans, I think, are forced in their own way to do this now, as they live in a disordered society, so also are we experiencing a disordered society. And that's why Russell matters more now than he did in the 70s. Because he can be, this book more particularly than just the rest of his work, this is the book you might go to as a kind of strange and unusually written, something that isn't the typical argument, and get lost in it and realize that there's an argument for order that doesn't depend upon simple abstractions and doesn't depend upon you universalizing your own beliefs, but there's something richer that goes back thousands of years that nonetheless must change. At least its expressions must change or its forms must change. That's, I think, why returning to our roots, or recognizing that we do have roots, they may be atrophied, but they're still there.
The question came from my colleague Donald Devine at the Fund for American Studies, and he and I have talked about these issues many times. One of the things I would bring up here, there's just recently this year been published a book called Imaginative Conservatism, and it's a collection of letters from Russell Kirk. And he addresses some of these concerns about natural law and, in particular, the place of Thomism in American politics. Kirk was somewhat critical of sort of hardline Thomists. And certainly there are people who approach natural law in such a almost sectarian way that it becomes sort of self-segregating. It becomes very ineffective in terms of having an influence on the body politic. I actually disagree somewhat with what Sam had said much earlier about Russell Kirk's relationship to natural law and to certain related questions. Kirk and Burke both have a certain distance from natural law. It's not that they're against natural law, it's not that they deny it, but they are very reluctant to articulate it in a way that might be considered excessively precise. And in Burke in particular, but this comes through in Russell Kirk as well, the role of providence has to be factored in here. And it's not necessarily the case that reason is going to be sufficient for us to know the things that we need to know, even outside of religion. And that's, there's sort of a double-edged to this sword here, because on the one hand, the advantage of natural law is that you can talk about metaphysics, you can talk about the transcendent without having to be sectarian, without having to speak specifically about religious questions. There's a virtue in that. There is some value in that. On the other hand, there is also the tendency for some people to use natural law, therefore, as a kind of imposture, as a kind of substitute for religion. And that's something which is not only rather sinister in some aspects, but is also inauthentic to the human heart. I think of another letter in this collection that James Person put together of Kirk's letters, in which Kirk is talking about James Burnham, one of the other great conservatives of the 20th century. And he says, well, you know, Burnham's a utilitarian and I'm a romantic. What Kirk meant was that Kirk was a romantic in the sense of Walter Scott or Benjamin Disraeli, and that there's a certain intuitive and aesthetic connection to the transcendent, which is important for both Burke and Kirk, and which is quite distinct, I think, from the sort of desiccated rationalism that one often encounters among the most ardent proponents of natural law.
Very good. And with that, I'm going to bring us to a close here. We appreciate you all coming today. And I have to say, before I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, I have to say, as a former Wilbur Fellow, 20 years ago, actually right now, I was in Mikasa as a Wilbur Fellow, that I, like many others in the room, have a debt of gratitude and thanks to Annette Kirk. And since Russell is no longer with us to be able to receive applause today, I'd like to ask you to join me in honoring Annette. And I'd ask you to join us outside after this. We have some refreshments, wine and cheese reception out there. We also, I'm told, have brochures from the Russell Kirk Center out there for the taking. And so I wish you all a good evening, and I'd ask you to join me now in thanking our panelists for their great remarks today.